Boker. Today's Daf Yomi is Nazir Yud Ches, and we're going to start on Yud Ches Amud Aleph on 18a at the top, as the Gemara is continuing to try to answer a question that was raised in yesterday's Daf by Rav Ashi. Rav Ashi asked the question, Nazar, let's say a person became a Nazir while they were in the cemetery, so they took a vow of Nazir, so they're standing in the cemetery. Do they require giluach or not? In this case, what does giluach mean? So the basic point is that if it would be a regular person who became a Nazir, not somebody in the cemetery, then if he became tamei, if he came upon a dead body, then he'd have to go through the purification process, which is a 7-day process where he gets the ashes, the mechatas, water of the red heifer sprinkled upon him on day 3 and day 7. Then he goes to mikvah on day 7. Then he cuts off the hair from his body. That's called giluach. And then on the 8th day, he brings the korban tumah. So the question that was asked by Rav Ashi is if this person was a Nazir in the Beis HaKvaros while he was standing in the cemetery, became a Nazir, does he still have to do this giluach or not? Because he doesn't bring the korban tumah, do we say he's also exempt from the giluach? That's the question. So the Gemara says the following. Tashma, the time rosh. We're trying to answer this question from the fact that it says about a person who came in contact with a dead body. The time rosh nisro, v'gilach rosho, b'yom taraso. That this is the law of giluach. That if he becomes tamei, then he has to cut off the hair of his head on day 7. And so says the Gemara, since it says v'rosh nisro, talking about a person whose hair was tahor at that time. B'tar shenitma kasab b'davar. Pasuk's talking about somebody only who was tahor when he became tamei, but not a Nazir who was a Nazir in the cemetery. So b'tar shenitma kasab b'davar shahu ta'un havara seir v'havas tziporin. Only that person requires the bringing of the birds, i.e. the korban tumah, the o and the chatas of the birds, in addition to the asham of the sheep that he brings. And only such a person who was tahor originally when he was a Nazir is required to cut his hair. So the Gemara asked the question, V'liftor as a Nazir b'kever, she'ein ta'on havar seir v'avos tziporin. So, and the Gemara says, that's not a question, this is the end of this brisa, but we're going to exempt the person who became Nazir while he's standing in a cemetery. He does not require not only the korban tumah, but also not the removal of the hair. Gemara says, but why is that the case? Shouldn't we just say the opposite? Just like somebody who was tar who became tamei, he requires tar and havara seir vavasi parin. It's just like somebody who was tar when he became tamei, i.e. the Nazir who was tar, he requires the bringing of the birds and the removal of the hair. Misha haya tamei mitchila. Somebody who was initially tamei, for sure, shouldn't it be the case that he'll require the removal of the hair and the bringing of the birds? No, we learned that from the verse. The verse is telling us, it refers to somebody who was tahor and then he became tamei. Only such a person, so we're saying that the verse is telling us that only somebody who's tahor and then become tamei, does he require the removal of the hair to bring in the birds? And we're exempting the person who was the Nazir in the kever, the person who accepted Nazir, so is in the cemetery. Shma mina. So this person who was standing in the cemetery, ironically, because he was on a worse level going in, he doesn't require the removal of the hair, whereas the person who had been tahor, he needs a greater purification process. It's a very ironic point. So it says the Gemara, Man Tana, Hadatana Rabbanan. Now the Gemara asks another question. Who's the source of the following brisa? So we had cited earlier in yesterday's daf. Who's the source of the following brisa? That says, Ein bein tamei shenazar and nazir tar shenitma. There's no real distinction between a person who becomes a Nazir while standing in the cemetery, the Tamei Nazir, to a Nazir who was tahor became tamei. Ela shetamei shenazar. But the distinction is that to somebody who was tamei who became a Nazir, shvi shalo olam minyan. He starts to count his Nazirus, he starts to count the days on the seventh day of the purification process. The reason is because he doesn't bring the carbon tumah, so therefore he can start counting on day 7, whereas the Nazir Tahor, says the Gemara, Nazir Tahor, Nazir Tahor, his 7th day does not count because he needs to bring the carbon tumah the next day, presumably, and so therefore he only starts to count on day 8. Starts out to count as Nazirus on day 8. So who's the author of this brisa? So Amar of Chlista, this is the author of this brisa is Rebbe. The Amar Rebbe, Ein Nazirus Torah Chala Elad Shmini. So Rebbe is the one who says that you only start to count your Nazirus, the new Nazirus, on day 8. The time of Rabbi Yossi bar Rabbi Yehuda, if you want to say it's Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda, Ha Amar Nazirus Tatara. Mishvi Yehuda. Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda says you start to count the new Nazirus from day 7. My Rabbi Yossi. Where is this opinion of Rabbi and Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda? The Tanya, we learned it from the following brisa. What does the brisa say? It says in the pasuk, "V'kidish es rosho bayomahu," that when you do your purification process, you have to bring the carbon tumah. What are these carbonos tumah? The chatos, the oah, are the birds, and then you're going to be atoned for the sin that you made. The Kiddush es Rosho, and your head will be elevated, sanctified, raised by Yomahu on that day. So how is this approved for Rebbe? How do we derive from your Rebbe's position, Rabbi Yossi bar Rabbi Yehuda's position? So the Brisa says, the Kiddush es Rosho by Yomahu, by Yom Havas Karbanosef. When do you start to be Mekadesh Yerosha? When do you start to count your Nazirus? On the day you bring the karbanos. That's the Rebbe's position. That's day 8. Whereas Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda says, B'yom tiglachto. And Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda says, no, on the day of your haircut. What's the day of your haircut? I.e., day 7. So that's the day that you start to count the new count. So therefore, that price over there that says you only start to count it on day 8, if you're a Nazir Tar, whereas a Nazir Tummy sounds current down 7, that's the position of Rebbe. Whereas Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda says that you start to count your count on day 7. The Gemara says, "V'hada tanan," and that which we learned, Nazir shenitma tumas harbe eino maybe ela carbon achas. The Gemara says, "Well, tell us now who another brayse is." That which we learned in the Mishnah in Krisos staff test. The Mishnah in Krisos tells us that if there's a Nazir Shenitma Tumas Harbe, if there's a Nazir who became Tameh many times, Einu Mevi Eli Karban Echad. He's only going to bring 1 carbon. Now, Gemara is going to have to figure out what the scenario is where Nazir Tameh became Tameh many times, only brings 1 carbon. But also, Gemara assumes that it's not an obvious case, because obviously, if you just were in the cemetery one day, you kept going back and back to that same cemetery the same day, obviously you only bring 1 carbon. That's 1 tumah. And obviously, if you were tameh and then you became tahor, and then you became tameh again, obviously you'd bring 2. So what's the scenario that has to tell us this chiddush that you only bring 1 carbon? So who's the author of this Mishnah? So increases. So says Rav Chisda, the author of this Mishnah is going to be Rabbi Yossi bar Rabbi Yehuda. Why? Because he says Nazirus Tahara Mishvi Chayla. He says that you start to count your new Nazirus from day 7, even though you haven't brought the carbon. Where we have the scenario that the Mishnah Krisos is referring to. Let's say you became Tameh on day 7 after you start to count your new count. And then you go back and you become Tameh again on day 7 after you start to do your new count. But so you became tahora again, but since you weren't able to bring the carbon yet, because you can't bring the carbon to day 8, even though you started counting on day 7, you're only going to be liable for 1 sacrifice there, because you were only you weren't eligible yet for the carbon. Because if you want to say it's the position of Rebbe, who's the Mishnah in Krisos is like Rebbe, that you only bring 1 carbon, if you became tummy on the 7th day, and then you became tummy again on the 7th day, you have never changed your status to a new period of Nazirus. So therefore it's called Tuma Arechtahi. It's 1 long Tuma. And if it's 1 long Tuma, we're not going to judge you. We're not going to make you bring multiple sacrificial offerings. And also, if it would be talking about a case where you were tummy on day 8, and if you were talking about where you became tummy on day 8 and then you became tummy again on day 8, no, but that moment you were able to bring this sacrifice. Since you were able to bring the sacrifice, then therefore, for that reason, we're going to say, since you're able to bring the sacrifice, you're going to have to bring multiple offerings for each time you became tameh again. My time with the Rebbe. What's the reasoning for Rebbe? The reasoning for Rebbe that you bring the carbon on, that you only start to count your Nazirus on day 8 and not on day 7. What's the reasoning for Rebbe? He says based upon the verse, that only once you are doing the kapara, once you get the atonement, the ability to bring the carbon, and only then do you sanctify your head, only then do you count your Nazirus again. Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda says, Im Kain Lemakrav Kidesh Rosho. Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda says you start to count on day 7. So he says, if you're right, Rabbi, the pasuk could have just had a Kidesh Rosho. We're on the top of 18b. So if you're correct, Rabbi, it could have just said a Kidesh Rosho. Bayomahu Amoli. Why does it have to say Bayomahu? So it says Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda on top of 18b. If it doesn't relate to day 8, because we already said we were speaking about day 8. So if we're not going to, you don't need it to teach us that you start to count your Nazirus on day 8, because even if it wouldn't have written that, we would have known that. So therefore, so apply it to day 7 and tell us that Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda is saying the chiddush is even though you can't bring your carbon until day 8, you could start counting your Nazirus on day 7. So what does Rabbi do with these words? It's going to teach us the following thing. Is to tell us that you start to count your new Nazirus even before you brought your karbanos. You start to count the Nazirus from the beginning of day 8, even before you started your karbanos. So that's the chiddush of Bayomahu. So the Gemara says, so the Gemara asks the question. So Rav Chisda said that the Mishnah in Negayim, the Mishnah in Krisos, follows the position of Rav Yossi Bar Yehuda, who says that you start to count, who says that you only bring one carbon tuma in a situation where you became tameh on day 7 because you weren't able to bring the carbon yet. And he doesn't want to say it's like Rebbe, because Rebbe says you would bring the carbon on day 8. So if you became tummy on day 7, you still haven't reached that time yet. So the Gemara says, but why was Rav Chisda forced to say that the Mishnah increased? This is like Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda. Why he could also say it's like Rebbe. Look, could go into nitma. Take out the word the chazia. Look, could go into nitma b'leil shmini. Why don't we say we're talking about a scenario where you became tummy on the night of the 8th? The Rebbe, and so it could still be Rebbe, because Rebbe would say since at that time it's the night of the 8th, so therefore, technically speaking, you could start your time of Nazirus, but you just haven't brought your carbon yet, and so therefore, according to Rebbe, you should have multiple tumas. So midelo mukimaka Rebbe, from the fact that he doesn't say that if you became tummy on day 8, Rebbe would say that you have to bring multiple karbanos for the tumah. He must be at the position that Laila is lav mechutzer zman. It must be that he must be at the position, according to Rebbe, the nighttime is not something that is mechutzer zman, meaning to say that the night is not lacking the time. It's meaning to say that you're not able to start counting at the night, because the night is something that fundamentally the new Nazirus hasn't started. It's not just that I can't technically bring it because it's not the time for the carbon. It must be that Rebbe's at a position that night is, we haven't yet got to the time of bringing the carbon, because so therefore it must be that Rebbe's at this position, which is a dispute elsewhere, which we had in Chagig already, whether or not it's mechusar zman. So Amar Bada Bar Abba, no, it's possible that Rebbe says Laila is mechutzer zman, but it's possible he says Laila is not mechutzer zman. It's possible that he says Laila is mechutzer zman, but it's haba hatalia. Meaning to say, if you're going to say that the nighttime, it just hasn't arrived at the time of the Naziris yet, the new Naziris, then Amos Mechsi Carbon. If you're going to say that the night is the time of the new Naziris, it's just nighttime, so it's lacking the time. When would the nighttime? When would be appropriate for the carbon? Safra. So therefore, only in the morning. So therefore, Naziris Nami L'Chaylat Safra. So we say also the Naziris wouldn't apply till the morning. If you say the nighttime is not lacking the time, it's just not a time for the Naziris, then if that's the case, Naziris Tahara. So if that's the case, Naziris Tahara Chaylam the Urta. Well, if that's the case, the Naziris of the Tahara also started from the night, and since it therefore became Tameh after it started, so therefore he would have to bring multiple karbanos, and therefore wouldn't be able to be exempt with just one karban for all the tumos. So therefore we're going to say hava hataya. So the reason why Rav Chutza did not say that our Mishnah is talking about a case where you became Tameh on the eighth night is because, or in the night going into the eighth day, is because there's no possibility to say that the Mishnah is like Rebbe. And so therefore, you can't prove from here that Rav Chutza says that nighttime is not Mechusar Zman. So the Gemara says, Gufa. Now this Gufa is unusual because every other Gufa in the Shas is a citation of an earlier quotation that the Gemara just discussed, and now it's going into it. But this case, it's not. So the language of Nazir is Meshuna. So the Gemara says, Gufa. Nitma b'shvi v'chazer v'nitma b'shvi. That let's say a person became tamei on day 7 and then became tamei again on day 7. Eino maybe el carbon echad. He only brings one carbon because he has not yet gotten to the time where he could bring the carbon. Nitma b'shmini v'chazer v'nitma b'shmini. But let's say he became tamei on day 8 and then he comes again tamei on day 8. Maybe carbon I'll call echad v'echad. And he has to bring a carbon for each one because since he became tamei after he had the obligation to bring the carbon, so therefore he has to bring a carbon on all of them. And the days of the Naziris, matchil mona miyad. Divrei Rabbi Eliezer. There's a lot of problems here with the girsa, but the way most, like let's say the simplest way to read it is actually ironically not simple, but is that matchil mona miyad means he starts to count immediately on day 7, meaning to say, Nitma b'ishmini v'chazer nitma b'shmini, maybe carbon al kol echad. He brings the carbon on day 8 for each one, but he starts in Naziris miyad, i.e. on day 7. That's the position of Rabbi Eliezer, which is also consistent with the position that we had seen earlier in the name of Rabbi Yossi bar Rabbi Yehuda. Whereas the Chachamim say carbon echad al kol, whereas now we see a third position. So we've seen the position of Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda that you start to count on day 7. We saw, and you only bring your carbon tum on day 8. We saw the position of the Chachamim that you start to count your zeros on day 8, and you bring the carbon tum on day 8. Now we have another position of that was the position of Rabbi. Now we have the position of the Chachamim who say carbon echad al kol ad sheyavi chataso. Says you only bring one carbon on. If you became tamei even on day 8 until you brought your sin offering from part of your carbon tumah on day 8. Hevi chataso v'nitma v'hevi chataso v'nitma maybe carbon al kol echad v'echad. Let's say you brought your carbon chatas and then you became tamei, and then you would bring a carbon on every single one. Hevi chataso v'lo hevi asham al moneh. Let's say you brought his chatas, but he didn't bring the asham, then he starts to count the Naziris once he brings the chatas. Whereas Rabbi Shmuel ben Osher, Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka Omer is a fourth position. He says Kishem shechataso ikvaso. Just like if you haven't bring the chatas yet, you can't start your new count. Kain ashamo ma'akvo. He says it's not just the chatas that prevents you from counting. Also, if you haven't brought the asham yet, you can't start your new count yet. You have to bring the asham. So we see from here these positions. You can't start your new Nazirus until such time as you brought your sin offering. You can't move forward until you've really expiated your sin. And so there are different levels of how we see that you've gone through this purification process. One level is once you've immersed in the mikvah on day 7. Another level is no, you have to be capable of bringing the carbon. That's the position of Rebbe on day 8. Another position is no. You have to have actually brought your sin offering, which is the first level, and then the other position is no. You actually have to have brought your guilt offering, the asham. You have to have brought all 4 karbanos. So Bishlam, Rabbi Eliezer, Amakra. So I understand the position of Rabbi Eliezer, who says that you start to count immediately on day 7 is based upon the verse. And so even though you didn't bring your karbanos, the Rabbanan, I understand the position of the Rabbanan who say you start to bring it only after you brought your chatas, because it says because it says the Rabbanan are based upon the position because it says hahu, that he starts to count on that day, which they say even though he didn't yet bring his asham. Our Rabbi Shmo says that you can only count once you brought your asham. Ahu amaway. What does he use the word ahu for? Amrocha ahu. Afapisho hevi also means you could count even though you didn't bring your 3rd carbon that day, which is the olah, because the olah is not a sin offering, and so therefore you could start to count and move forward even before you brought the olah. The Rabbanan olah lo bai miyuta is the Boris. The Rabbanan say no. Obviously, the Rabbanan say olah lo bai miyuta. You don't need a special limitation on the olah to tell us that it does not prevent the moving forward, because it's not a part of a sin offering. That's a doron ba'almahu. That's just a gift. So of course you could start moving forward. It's not actually a sin offering. And my time out, the Rabbanan. What's the reasoning for the Rabbanan who say that if you haven't brought the chatos, you can't move forward? And the reasoning is because it's based upon the fact, it says in the Brisa, the Tanya, going to the Brisa, the Hizer Hashem as your main Israel, maybe Keves ben Shnasola Hashem. It says that it says about a Nazir became Tameh that he the Hizer Hashem as your main Israel. The Keves ben Shnasola Hashem. He brings a Keves for an Hashem if he became Tameh. Ma Tamalom. Why does the pasuk have to say that he has to? What's the difference between the Asham and the Olah here in the Shlomo? Because I know that all the other Karban Ashams in the Torah prevent the purification process. I might think that this one also does. Tamal Omar, Vehazer Vehavi, Alpha Pishol Havi, Hazer. The pasuk says Vehazer Vehavi to teach us, even though he hasn't brought the sheep for the Asham, nevertheless, he starts to count as Nazirus. Whereas Rabbi Yishmael ben Olash, Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka says, Vehazer, Vehavi, Amasai Hazir, when does he start to count? Only Bisman Shehavi, only when he brought his Asham prior to that. So, okay, we'll stop the recording here, but before we stop, what I said, the fundamental concept is, we're talking about how you can move forward for redemption, for your purification process. How much do you have to do? Do you just have to have gone through the simple purification process of going to the mikvah on day 7 and having the ashes, or do we need to say that you have to become eligible to bring the sacrifice, or do we say that you need to have brought your chatos, your sin offering, your basic sin offering, or do we say you have to have brought the special asham of the Nazir? So these are the different disputes, but the basic idea is you can't move forward in the purification process until in the redemption process until you've expiated your sin. We'll stop the recording here, and I see Rabbi Yosef is here, and we say to everybody.